Okay, so plan for today is I want to kind of work through a few things, and some of this will be spread over today. Some of this stuff will be spread over tomorrow as well, kind of depending on how we move, and there's definitely some more stuff I need to research, so we'll do some of that tomorrow as well. So, kind of objectives as far as what we want to get done today, and what we're kind of going to go through today and tomorrow. So we want to talk about, hey, how do we influence React components? We've looked at some of that stuff already. We're going to do some more stuff with that. We wanted to look at implementing stateful components with use state hook. We've kind of looked at that already. We did a little bit. We did some of that with things you've kind of worked through, starting on the bug tracker project, as well as yes.
Are you recording?
I am.
Can you pause?
Yep, I can pause.
Last call.
Okay. So we want to talk about how to talk more about that use state hook for making components that have state. So we did a little bit with that. You've done a little bit with that already. We'll do some more with that. We want to get into using Axios to make HTTP requests. So previously we've used our APIs and we've been using them through Postman, you remember. That's been our main kind of source for testing those things, as well as we haven't really hooked React to the API yet. So we're going to use Axios as a library to do those, to make those HTTP requests. So that's one thing we want to cover here. We're also going to look at how we use environment variables, namely because we need to make the base URI for that API. We need to make that an environment variable. So we'll look at that as well. We need to look at the use effect hook. We've used the use state hook a little bit already, but we also really need to look at how the use effect hook works. And so we'll do that. We'll use that for things like, hey, I want to run some code when the control when the control shows up on the screen, when that component. So usually that's when the page loads, or that may be if some variables, some properties change. So we'll see some of that. Yeah.
So when you say hook, what do you mean by hook? Is this like some sort of function?
Yes. So a hook is a function. It's always a function. A hook is kind of a way to reach out. So with React, it's kind of a React concept. Okay. A hook is generally something where you're reaching out to another system. Is one way to think about it. Is you're reaching out to another dependency, another thing that's going on, and using that. So like use state is a hook, use effect is a hook. When we get into React router, there's a use navigation hook. So all of these relate to different things you might be bringing in. Does that make sense? It's one way to think about hooks. When we talk about hooks, we're often saying something like an event, right? We're hooking into where some other system is doing something. Some part of the system, we're hooking into that external system. Sometimes you hear it with games where you're kind of hooking into the game to exploit or cheat or whatever it may be. Yeah. So the term hook, I overall find not a terribly useful thing to really define as much when it's working with React. It's just something that's kind of like, hey, this is a hook, by the way. And so we just use it this way because it turns out it's not as important to understand how hooks work or what they are, as well as like just here's how I use something that somebody else has built. Now, if you get into kind of building your own hooks, then you may get into playing around with it a little bit more. But for at least these for our class here, I don't think we'll need to build our own hooks per se. Suffice to say, it's pretty simple, a pretty simple thing though. It just hooks into like the process, the React render process and things like that. Okay, so yeah, so we'll need to look at use effect. I'm going to take a look at React Toastify, which allows to send out toasts. There is some kind of styling stuff built in for, say, alerts in Bootstrap, but that doesn't really give you a way to easily show things on screen, as well as because that's basically something that frequently comes up. If something goes wrong, if there's an error or other message, oftentimes I need to pop something up, a quick message to say, hey, you know, your login credentials are wrong, or we successfully logged you in or logged you out, or whatever it may be. So we're going to use that as a way to kind of show alerts, as you might say, is Toast messages. We need to talk about how we handle errors, especially errors from the API. We built a lot into the backend code to send different error codes from our 404s or 400s or 401s, etc. And we want to make sure that we're handling those error codes and providing some useful feedback to the user. So that's another thing we need to look at, especially as we're getting into network requests, right? If you're making an HTTP request from one system to another, lots of things can go wrong along the way, and so you really need to be able to give good feedback to the user. Towards the end of this, and this will probably be, we'll see how far we get with this today, this will probably be more on tomorrow, is I want to look at using React Router for kind of building multi-page apps. So I showed you the other, I think last week, one way to do it just with playing around with state. But I want to show you the React Router package and kind of get us started on that and how we can use that to actually have the URL change and have the back navigation and the forward navigation and all those kind of things work. So from the user's perspective, when we get that in, it will still be, a coding perspective, it will still actually be one page. It will just look like to the users if it's multi-page. It's actually really slick because with React, you know, traditionally when we're building these things with PHP and ASP.NET and older technologies, traditionally anytime you click on a link or if you submit a form or things like that, it used to be that caused a page refresh, always. And that kind of created not the best user experience in a lot of ways, plus it just made things slow. And so having things done more on the client side, which is where we're going today, makes things a lot more just user-friendly, lightweight. It's just like, okay, I clicked the button and immediately went there, rather than feeling like it's kind of sitting and churning and you got a bite screen that you're looking at. So we can do a lot of nice things about dealing with things that take time, like loading data. So that's it. Another thing I also want to talk about quickly is using local storage to store the auth token. And the reason that that's relevant is because at least the way that we've got the systems and stuff that we've got so far, if you were to refresh the page, well then you lost your token because we haven't stored it anywhere long term. So we want to use local storage as kind of a common system. Sometimes people use session storage, but it provides a way to kind of save it to a file on the user system so that if you refresh the page, you're not immediately just logged out, or you may be able to persist the session longer than just like, you leave the page and you come back. So that's an important thing too, is to kind of persist the token. Cool. So those are the kind of things I want to try and get through this week. I'm going to try and break this up. I don't want to talk your ear off completely all today. I want to give you some chance to kind of get back in and play around with some of this stuff in your issue tracker projects. But we've got a few things we need to go to today if you can kind of follow through my list. So there's a bunch of different things that we need to talk about. So the plan for today is I want to work through this pet adoption project. So we've kind of built the back end so far, but we need to build a front end for it. Now, before we get started on building the front end, I want you to do two things. So I need you to go to this repo here, my pet adoption version 2, and I need you to clone it down. And I'll add the link to Discord for this. I have made a bunch of updates to it to get it back synced up with where our API projects are, because there were a few things that were kind of behind and needed to be there in order for us to hook it up and experiment with some things, especially authentication. So definitely pull that down. Even if you've kind of been coding along before, take this one down because it's got a bunch of stuff that's in addition to it.
So we can use the previous one, or
So you can't override one repo with another, right? So what you want to do, if you have another repo, you might just delete it from your computer and then clone this one down. That'd be the best thing for you to do, is delete it and then clone it down. Once you get it pulled down, go ahead and open that project in VS Code. Okay. So once you get the back end pulled down, the API project pulled down, remember that you'll need to run npm space install on the console to get all the dependencies installed. So definitely go run that. Here. So open it in VS Code, run the npm install. You'll find under the data folder, there are some JSON files of data that we need to pull in. So like I've got my pets and my roles and my users. So I want you to grab that data and get it into your local MongoDB pages. Meaning you won't have those roles yet, so So look under the data folder. You see there's that data there. Okay. So let me pull it up here. So what you want to do go here. So there's like a pets.js JSON. You're gonna pull up MongoDB Compass. Is the way one way to do it. You can also do this on the shell. But what I would do, until this boots up. Okay, I'm going to connect to my local server. And so I'm going to go into pet adoption as my database. Let's say I want to import pets. So go down to pets. There's a import and export buttons here. So you see where it says add data. So you can click add data, import file. You can say browse to that file. So here I've already gotten to that folder. It's under the repo, version 2, data. So I bring in pets. Okay, so I'm going to bring in pets, tell it's a JSON file, hit import, and it'll bring that in. Now it's not going to work for me because I already have that data, and you just go through that one by one, importing each of those collections. But that will get to a point where you for sure have pets in your vision roles.
So I got JSON.
So go to data. Okay. Yeah. And so you just do each of those one by one. So which collection are you going to pick here? Yeah, you may need to create, yeah, so you may have to create like the roles collection and then you go to the roles collection, because you have a roles collection. Okay. See that? So go over there and plus add one. You got the data in there. So we've got an name. So once you get in there, once the data is imported, you should be able to run and start dev to get the server up and running. And then what I want you to do there, just to make sure everything works, is try to log in to the system. So the username, the email there that you'll want to use is admin@example.com, and the password from that data should be password. Not terribly secure, but good enough to test with. So if you can test it with Postman, just make sure you can get in to log in and out with that data. Just make sure. You want to make sure you're running a start date, because it's not defined for the start command because of production. Start. Oh, well, yeah, you need to add the document. That's what's missing. So .env, I'll pull that up. What I've got here, that's what's in my .env file. It doesn't matter. I'll just paste something in here into Discord of what I've got, but it doesn't need to be the exact same thing. My notes here.
Is it NPM start dev or NPM run?
You're right. npm run start dev.
Okay, cool.
Always watch that so they bring it out to the projects up. This is the first one to get it. So as our systems name added more file, you put it in the tools, it needs to be able to reach. There it goes. Thank you. So, hold on, I'm gonna read that. There were only 4 weeks of class work, something like that. Around December 16th. Yeah. So you put it on those. So you run it out.
No, 16. It's only missing one. With it's Joe. Is it you? What? No way. Just how you want Actually, Val, you have to understand that almost everything is good. Exactly. Almost nothing's there in my favorite. Yeah, true. But you get the operator on the other set. You know, you take your corner down, bam, dash out. You want a half a second. They did. Well, that's why they rebuffed it.
Yeah, it's still not.
No, but still, like,
I don't know how to play this.
smokes.
I think it's actually in my followers on instructions.
Okay. If you've already got the back end up and running, the next thing you want to do is there's another repository over here for the starter for the front end. So you're going to fork that repo and then pull it down because you need your own version of the starter. So what you want to do, if I can go in here, you should be able to hit the fork button up top and fork it down to where you want it to be. Now I'm going to have to make my own repository. So new repository, and can I get to, I'm going to have to mark that as a template so I can fork it. So I want to go to here, check that box, use this template. And so I'm going to call this one pet adoption React. So that's what I want you to do is fork off of that or use it as a template and bring it into your own side. So once you get that forked, you're going to pull that down again as well, clone that repository on your system and lift up in VS Code and try to get it running too.
No, it is still hard to ignore it.
It shouldn't be asking you for a given. It's asking you for a given.
Yeah, all we have to do is all we do on the desktop. And we just send that to them.
No, get canceled because you're doing it on there. Yeah, but this is not what I want you to do. So, follow the link. Which was the first of this one. Yeah, so you go to start of the phone. So you're going to do something different. That's going to create you an empty phone. I don't want you to create an empty phone. So it uses template. And you're going to name it pivot option jack. So difference there, Evan, is that's going to give you all the code that I have to start with rather than starting with something empty. And so that's going to speed the process up a little bit. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if that's public or private for this thing. That's up to you. It doesn't matter either way because we're just using the main branch. I think there's only stuff on the main branch for this repository. So I'm going to clone that down. Clone that here. And I am going to open that with code. And so I should have this up and running there. Okay, so just like we did with the other one, we do need to go in and do npm install to get all the dependencies. That's going to take a bit of time because React has a few dependencies. Uh-huh. So I ran the Create React app, but then I made some changes on top of that. So I went ahead and coded up a few things just to kind of give us some starter points rather than having us write parts of the code. So I wrote the first part of that already.
You have to show us how to do that template thing because that was cool on getting it.
So it's literally if I just go back to here, you just go to settings, and I just mark this as a template. It's just a checkbox. That's all it takes. So you can use that to say, hey, I've got a baseline for starting a project, make it, and then go from there. So I cleared out some of this, the placeholder code that was there, and added my own placeholder code in there. Is it running? Oh, there it is. Yeah. So you should be presented with something that looks like this, with the simple nav bar that goes to 2 different pages, login and pet list. And so it's got a header and a footer and a body. And that's really all that we're starting with. But I figured that that would get us going a little bit faster. Just to so let's just check. I want to check and make sure that everybody's. Okay. So kind of long story short, is what we're trying to get set up. We have our API, running on port 5000. We have the React front end of the so we have both of those systems running on. Yep, that's what you want to do. Yep. And that's where we're going to spend. That's really where we're going to put a lot of it. Is on the we need the same back end, so the stuff we do on the front end. Oh, there it is. Okay, so let's take a look at the code that we have. So just running you through what's here. As I said, I kind of got rid of the starter CSS. So the stuff that was in app CSS is gone. The app stuff that was app index is gone. I've already gone in and brought in Bootstrap. So Bootstrap's already here because we already talked about how to do that. So you see the Bootstrap CSS. You'll also see that there's an import Bootstrap directly beneath that if you're looking at the index.js file like I am here. That is to bring in the JavaScript side of Bootstrap as well. And I did mention that to a few people already. That's needed if you want to do stuff like the navbar, because the navbar requires a little bit of JavaScript. Now, ideally, we'd like to replace that, but I'm going to start with just bringing in the JavaScript for Bootstrap. All good, right? So that's one thing to know that's going on there. Working down a little bit to the application, you'll see that there is a little bit of code in here already. So bringing in useState, and I'm bringing in a few components that I've kind of stubbed out for us. So I've subbed out a navbar component, a footer component, login component, login form component, and a pet list component. Not too much there, but just enough to get us up and running with some of the stuff we've already talked about. You'll see in here that I am declaring, I'm using that use state to declare 2 pieces of state. So one piece of state I'm declaring is this auth variable, and I'm going to use that to track the user's login status. So I'm going to start with that. If the user's not logged in, we're going to set that to null. And then when the user logged in, we'll put in the data there. So things like, we'll want the token, right? We'll want the token that the user's using. We may want the whole payload of data that's in that token as well. So all that kind of information is going to go into that auth variable. Does that make sense? So that's where we're going to manage whether or not the user is logged in. You'll also see, as we talk about here, I've got a screen variable, and that's just going to track for now which screen you're on. Okay, so we're going to eventually replace this screen variable with React Router, but I'm going to kind of work my way up to there. And probably, we'll see if we get that today. We might not get to that till tomorrow. But starting with this, so we won't have to immediately jump into React Router. So initially, I'm saying we start at the login screen /login, and then that will change from there on. So I've got a few event handlers here. I've got onNavigate, which takes the event and names ref. So that's just going to change the screen. That's what's being hooked up to the 2 links in the navbar to switch you between the pet list and the login screen. And there's 2 functions here that aren't used yet, but we're going to hook up as we work through. So I've got an onLogin function, which takes this auth, is going to call setAuth, and then also move you to the pet list screen. So it's going to save, once you log in, we're going to call this, going to save the information that we need for later, and put you on that screen. When you log out, we're going to clear it out and move you back to the login screen. That makes sense? So that's kind of just hooking up some piping that we need as we work through here. But that's basically how those variables are going to be set, is through those different events. Cool? So our components will end up calling those 3 event handlers, calling onNavigate, calling onLogin, and calling onLogout. Okay. So if I scroll down further and look at what we're rendering, so I've got a div on the outer side. You can see that I'm bringing in the navbar component up top, the footer component down at the bottom, and in the middle we've got a main section. So just things to remember from semantic HTML components. Typically your page should have a header that contains anything that's part of the top of the page, footer for anything that's at the bottom of the page, and then we're going to have the name in the middle. So you're kind of seeing that spread out. Other tricks in here, one of the things you'll notice with the example code that I've given is I've solved already one of the really common problems that comes up. Notice that the footer is sticking to the bottom. There are a few different ways to fix this, but this is really the solution that I recommend. So namely what I'm doing for that is I'm using a few different Bootstrap classes that already exist. Okay. And so I want to just run through those real quick so you know about those, because these are definitely things you'll want to apply to kind of whatever project you're building. So up at the top on the app level, you'll notice that I've added 3 Bootstrap classes. And so this is part of the magic formula to make this work. So minvh100 says that this div has a minimum height of 100 VH. That's what it says. Minimum height of 100 VH. 100 VH means it has to be as tall as the viewport. So that just means that this tag has to be as tall as the screen. It could be taller. It's not limiting it to just that tall, but it has to be at least that tall. So that's going to force it to have that height. That first part is important. The next thing I'm doing is I'm doing deflex to change it to a flex container. So now this app as a whole is going to be a flex container. And I'm also making it a flex column, which means the direction of that flex container is top to bottom instead of left to right. Okay. So that's just setting things up, right? So give it a minimum height and make it a vertical flex container. What we then do, this is the part that is kind of sneaky, is I say then this thing in the middle this div, I'm giving it a class of FlexGrow1. FlexGrow1 says that this div should take up all the space that's available. So the footer gets some space to allocate to itself. The nav bar gets some space to allocate to itself. And if there's anything, and the main takes its space, if there's anything left over, all the leftovers go to the state of the middle. Cool?
Very cool.
So that's what's stretching it out. So basically what I do is I stretch out the main, the center section, and that is what forces the footer to the bottom. And it has that benefit of, again, stretching everything out so it's all the full screen. Some of the other approaches that you can do to put the footer at the bottom, you don't have that benefit. It also means that because I'm not using things like sticky positioning, this footer can actually be off screen. It doesn't always have to be blocking the screen. So this is kind of that recommended formula to make things bigger. That always comes up. Next thing to look at, you'll see on the main, I have two classes. I've got container. That's a really important thing to put in there somewhere. Because remember, from Bootstrap's perspective, if you don't put a container anywhere, then all your stuff will be all the way to the edges. So the container kind of brings it in, and typically you can think of it as kind of using maybe 80% of the width of the screen. In reality, it's not that. It's actually fixed breakpoints. It's actually a certain number of pixels, and it staggers. But that's important for bringing everything in. That way I don't have to include containers in any of these components that are inside of me. They're all implicitly inside of a container. You'll also see I'm doing MY5. That's just margin on the top and bottom to get the, make sure that the main content of the page isn't directly up adjacent to the nav bar or adjacent to the footer. So that's just going to space those things. So this is kind of a good starting point. I played around with the colors a little bit too. That's obviously not something you have to do if you want to stick with the white theme. But I switched it over to background black and text white, which is where you've seen things flip over. So that gives you kind of the layout and the reason why the app component is structured that way. That usually works out for most applications that kind of use some of those tricks to start with. Does that make sense? Cool. So those are things I usually put in up in the app. So let's look down into here. Now I did one thing a little bit different here. This is not something you have to do. I just wanted to demonstrate it. Some people will throw all their components directly in source, and you can absolutely do that. I don't have a problem if you want to do that. Other people have a habit of taking their components and putting them into a components folder. That's fine. As long as that components folder is inside a source, you're good. Just don't take the components folder and not have it under source, or it won't work. So under source, I've got a folder for my components, just to try and keep things organized. So we can look at the navbar component. You'll see the navbar component has a few properties that are coming in, off and screen and on navigate. Right now, off and screen are kind of grayed out because I'm not doing anything with them yet. But those are both of those state variables up from the application. So we're passing that stuff down because eventually we will possibly need some of those things. And then the on navigate is just so that it makes work. This navbar here is not set up to be, just so we're clear, this is not a responsive navbar. This one always stays expanded. I want to talk about how to do the collapsing stuff, but I want to start with the simple version, which is always expanded. So that's where you'll see navbar, navbar expand, navbar dark, BG dark. That's just kind of setting up the navbar. If you say navbar expand LG, navbar expand ND, you're giving it a breakpoint and telling it when to expand. If you just say navbar expand, that says we'll always keep it horizontal. Cool. So this one's not mobile responsive yet, but I wanted, that's one of the things I did want to walk through. So general structure, tag structure, you can see I've got a header on the outside. I've got nav, UL, LI, and then anchor tags is where the actual links are. if you're looking at the bootstrap example kind of blends the nav and the header. They don't actually include a header in the code examples on the bootstrap website, but I would recommend doing it with nav and header this way rather than how bootstrap does it from a semantic purpose, if that makes sense. So this is a little bit different than the bootstrap example because it's got that helm around it, but that's generally good practice to do. Okay, so that's kind of what's in there, and you can see you just click on the links and it calls on navigate, telling you where to go. Let's look at the footer real quick. Footers, nothing fancy. It's just a footer tag using that semantic element. I've got BG dark, text white, just to change and adjust the colors. I usually find a little bit of patterns useful there too. So P2, sometimes I'll do P2 or P3 depending on what kind of looks good. Other things to note in here, there's one thing that it may have been a while since you touched. Do you remember that there's these things in HTML, which you can use with React? So you see @copy, question mark, or @copy colon. That's what we call an entity symbol. So that's going to be replaced with the copyright symbol. Those are things you want to remember anytime you have special characters that you need to bring in, copyright symbol, bullets, quotes or single quotes and double quotes, all those kind of things, ampersands. A lot of these special characters you need to remember to look up those entity symbols for. Okay, good. But other than that, there's nothing really fancy there. The only reason I break this out as a component is it gives me more flexibility to move everything around. Right? It gives it kind of that semantic purpose of, hey, this is a footer. I can move all that code out of the application, especially if this gets much larger, right? Some websites you'll see have a relatively large footer, and so you may want to break that out. So I would recommend breaking your footer out, even if it's as small as this, just kind of in preparation for it. Cool. So that's one thing I would recommend is going ahead and making a footer component, even if there's not much code to it. Now, let's look at the login form. So login form, just a stub. All I put in there so far is the H1. Same way with the pet list. All I've got is the H1. Okay. So that's a kind of a quick rundown of the code that's already in. Any questions so far? Is that kind of all making sense? You kind of understand why I went ahead and threw some of those things together, just so we could get started quicker. All right. So where I want to focus first is I want to focus first on the login form, okay? And in trying to build that out, right? So this is kind of our step one is I want to start building out the login form. And first what I'm going to do is build it out in a way where it's just accepting some fixed credentials, namely admin@example.com password. It's just saying that's good or bad. And then I'll refactor that a little bit to add in Axios, to add in our API. Everybody good with that? So I'm going to lay out a basic form without Axios, and then we'll be adding Axios. Okay, so things to remember when you're building out forms. What tag do you have to add first?
Form.
You have to add form. Okay. Don't forget the form tag. That is really, really important to have a form tag. Okay. Things we need to generally recommend on a form. Oftentimes we'll put ID, an action, and a method. It turns out with what I'm going to do, it actually really doesn't matter. So I'm going to leave those alone for a minute. But oftentimes I do want to go ahead and include those as a fallback. Okay, inside of the form, I want to build it out with two fields. So we want to build a email field and a password field. Okay. Remember that every field needs to have a label, so I'll have a label and an input for both of those two things. I try to group my elements together, so I'm going to wrap each pair in a div. So I'm going to start with a div. I'm going to say here is a label element, and oftentimes I'll go ahead and start with adding the class names immediately to get them to look right. So remember for label, this needs to be form label. This is going to be email. I'm going to add an input. Class name is form control. Oh, and this is an empty element, so I want to end it with a slash. Because an input cannot contain children. Okay, so if I just start with the class name here, I can already go to the browser and start looking at how this is going to look, right? So you can start to see kind of the basic structure, right? So at minimum, for sure, when you're building these in, you have to add a class. You want to add those bootstrap classes of form label and form control to get the styling right. But you'll remember that we often add a bunch of other attributes, right? So does anybody remember what are some of those other attributes that I need to add to here? Typically, either one, the label or the input.
Like an ID on the input and then for on the label.
Okay. Yep, so I generally need those things to link them. So I'm going to add in here. One of the oddities, remember, is it's HTML4 instead of just for. So we have for is linking it over to the other side. Things you'll also remember that I typically do is I'll usually use a name that is distinct within the website. So I don't usually want to give this just an ID of email because I'm going to have other form fields that are email. So I might say login form -email just to disambiguate where this is and where it's located. So I'm going to add that as the for attribute, and then yeah, the ID on the other needs to match up. Okay, Evan, you had a hand up.
I was going to ask why you're not writing type of text, but it just says it's default on the WP school, so I guess
yeah, so it does default to type text, right? What I'm kind of saying is that there's a bunch of things we want to add, right? I do want to add a type. Yes, the default is text. I typically do want to go ahead and include it just to make sure that I'm explicitly making a decision on that. So if I usually want to go ahead and include that just to say, yes, I meant to have text, or I meant to have blah, blah, blah. Now, things to remember, out of the box, you're asking about one of those attributes as type. There is a distinction between two different types here. So there's a text type and there's an email type. Okay. This is actually a case where I want to use the email type because I'm typing in an email address. So the type email is more appropriate here than using type text. And I would really recommend doing that instead. Why is that relevant?
So is that going to cause changes to the mobile phone keyboard?
Yes. The main reason we do that is for the mobile phone keyboard. Like, that's the main reason why we do this. It does have some impact on validation in terms of the browser. Like, the browser will automatically try and validate that this is a valid email. But the main reason that we want to do that is because of the soft keyboard. Okay. So that's an important thing to remember there with the login form. I just want to say type email. Are there any other attributes that I need to add? What other attributes do I need to add? Okay, so I could put a placeholder. What would you want to put as the placeholder? Okay, so let's say I do that. Example at email.com. Now, things to be careful with. Email.com. Is that a valid domain name? Does somebody own that domain?
Probably.
Okay. That's something you have to be very careful about. Okay. So you don't just put anything in there as an example. Okay. There's actually a special domain out there which exists for purposes of examples. Example.com is actually reserved. Okay, so if you need to put anything in there as a placeholder, as the second part, it's kind of convention to use example.com specifically.
So you could do like name.
Yeah, so that would be a little bit more appropriate.
I did not know that.
Long story short, things can happen, and then sometimes you end up sending things to these quote-unquote dummy emails. And well, that's a problem if you're spamming websites that are out there, such as email.com, right? So example.com is saying, okay, you're okay using this examples. We won't worry about all the spam. We expect it, right? So example.com gets spam all the time because it's there to be part of examples.
Do people really just type in what they see in that field?
Yeah, it happens sometimes. Wow. Yeah, it does happen. Things like that happen. Or people try things. It's the same reason why there's like the area code 555 is used in examples in TV because people try to dial those numbers that appear. It's like, hey, well, I'll just wonder what's at that number. And then you get all these spam calls from a random number. So that's one thing to put in there. I'm kind of hit or miss on whether or not that's a good idea in general to put placeholders there because sometimes it can be misleading. Like one of the things that happens, like we just kind of mentioned, is oftentimes users will see that and they'll go ahead and type in name and example.com and just see if it works, right? And maybe we don't want them to do that. Maybe we don't want them to try John Doe and Jane Doe and Mickey Mouse at example.com. And they'll do that if you do this. So we oftentimes may or may not. We want to be very careful about what we put in as a placeholder. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I remember coming across a web page.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what exactly the name was. It was something that really close to like Google or Gmail or something like that. But it was a guy, he said that he bought the domain for his wife or something like that. But it says like they get like so many emails of people like typing like the wrong thing to their server or something like that.
I read that. Yeah, I think I read that within a year or so. It was either on Reddit or it was a Medium, and I remember reading about that. And it might actually been through NPR. I forget what it was called, but it was a one-letter typo away from Gmail.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because I think the guy said he works for Google or something way back when he said he bought that.
Yeah. Well, I think it was they bought it before Gmail existed. But yeah. So it's important to think about what you put in as examples because people try that and do other things with it. Maybe they try to put as much accounts and do that. The other thing that's a gotcha is that this kind of looks like if you're not paying attention, if the contrast isn't really clear, it may not be obvious that is a placeholder and not actual text. And I will say that like Chrome's pretty good about out of the box fading things out. Other browsers are not as good. So my experience, I forget which one is the culprit between Internet Explorer and Firefox and Safari. I think Firefox is the one that last time I tested, their placeholders typically look like just black text. You can't actually tell. There's actually no color difference out of the box with the placeholder versus the actual text, which can get confusing. And IE's also had a history of treating that placeholder in a way that you could actually select it. Like it was temporarily there and then gone. So different browsers have implemented that placeholder differently, and that's one thing you have to be careful of. It's definitely something you need to test against different browsers because the browsers just don't treat the placeholder all the same. They don't all give it the same color or even the same. So it's one thing to watch out for. I'm going to go ahead and leave that in there. But one thing I'll sometimes do to try and work around it is I might just say enter email to try and help avoid some of those issues. Like then I'm not steering their hand and I'm not making it look like there's something there. So sometimes I will do that. Okay, so we've got a pair of a label and an input. Are there any other properties I need to set on either of those? Is there any other things that we talked about we want to set on the input?
Something about autocomplete or something like that.
There's an autocomplete which does what?
So like if you have a saved email password,
right. So typically want to set those things up, especially on a login screen. So I want to say autocomplete. And do you remember what the value is here? It's an easy one. It's just email. Yep. So that will just help the autocomplete out to know, okay, I can put your email in here. Okay. So I think that is good enough to start with. Let me pull up my example just to make sure I didn't have anything else that I am forgetting right now. There. Pull this over. And I wanted to go to this one. So, type. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good start. So I'm also gonna take this now. I'm gonna actually duplicate that whole div. I'm gonna add it again. And so this one I'm gonna switch up to be the password. So we're gonna have password, 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 password. And now autocomplete's a little bit weird. One of the things to know about the autocomplete is that there is a current password value and there's a new password value. And so if the user's entering a password that they're maybe changing or creating a new account, you want to set that as new password. That's going to change how things behave. Versus if it's the user's current password, which is our case here, we're going to set that as password, current password. So there actually is no just password. It always has to be current password or new password. Okay. Placeholder-wise, you'll kind of notice here what's happening with the placeholder. I can't really honestly tell from my screen the difference between that being a placeholder or that being text. It looks like the same. It looks like there's a password already typed in there. So usually in terms of passwords, I don't typically put a placeholder there. Although, well, that's why there is. It's auto-completing because I have a saved username and password. That's what it's looking at. Let me go back here a second and. Yeah, let me go here. There we go. So if I run it in an incognito browser, then it doesn't have my saved username and password. Yeah, so that looks fine, sort of. I mean, notice how the placeholder is showing up. It's literally showing you what's there. Yeah, it's literally showing you the text. So maybe we want to change that to something else. Right, let's say we just change it like that. The real problem here, though, too, is remember how I said, like, if you put a placeholder in for an email, people try to use that thing. If you put a placeholder for the password, believe me, they will try that as their password. So the safest thing you can do for passwords is generally like not include a placeholder there, because that will tend to cause some issues. So safest thing to do is not.
One thing I noticed about placeholders is kind of redundant, don't you think?
Yeah, they really are redundant. I mean, honestly, to me, labels are always a better choice over placeholders. I think from an accessibility standpoint, that's kind of where I've landed. Is sometimes placeholders are helpful, but more often than not, they're hurtful.
Yeah, I feel like the only place I've seen like a placeholder may be helpful is like they have certain rules on like a password.
Yeah.
And then they have email
Yeah, and that's one way you can do it. The other way to do that is there's actually a help text class that you can use, and you can actually just stick a message underneath the field. That's usually the safer way to do that. Is you just put the message underneath the field, that information, then it's always there, and actually the users know what it is. There's actually no confusion if it's under the field versus if it's in the field, the placeholder is. That plus text that's underneath behaves the same way on a browser, whereas the placeholder behaves differently on browser to browser. So that way I don't have to deal with browser specific issues. So that's our starting point. Okay. Now, one of the things you should immediately ask from there is you'll notice that I started copy and pasting. Like I wrote one and then I copied and pasted and did another. Tells you enough that that code is very similar. Right? That code is very similar. So one thing to consider, anytime you find yourself doing copy and pasting, especially with React, maybe there's a way around it, right? So what's one thing you can do to avoid copy paste with React? Component, right? So if I took this div, and I made that a component, right, including the div, the label, and the pass input. If I put that all together in a component, I would actually end up making the code easier to use, easier to read, and easier to work with, repeat. Now, it's not going to be much shorter because a lot of these attributes you just kind of have to give, right? But that's definitely one of the things we want to look at here. Okay. Now, before I do that, I do want to make a few changes. I do want to get the submit button in. I do want to get the rest of the components in. And I do want to do some spacing things and such before we extract that. But that is definitely one of the things I want to do today, is show you how to extract that as a separate component. Okay? So, one of the things you might notice is the spacing among these fields. So you can see maybe the password field is very close, the password label is very close to the bottom of the first field. So generally speaking, we want to have the labels close to the field that they belong to and farther away from the field that they don't go with. Does that make sense? So one of the things I typically do is we add a little bit of margin bottom on each of these divs. So typically I'll go in here and say class name, either MB2 or MB3, depending on how much space I'm trying to create. So I need to add that here, and I also need to add that up here. Okay. Now MB2 puts it kind of in the middle. Maybe I'll try going MB3 for this one. Yeah, that's about better space. So that's one of the things I commonly do, and that's part of why I have that overview, is it lets me put things along, attached to that group, such as spacing, that I don't get if I just directly put label input, label input, label input. Cool? So that's one of the reasons I have those divs wrapping around it. Okay. Next thing, I'm going to add another div. And so here we're going to add the components. I'm going to follow my same convention, and I'm going to add MB3 on this one as well. So in here is where I want to put that submit button. So it's going to be a button class, or sorry, button tag. Things to remember with this. Remember, we do want to use class name to style it. And so typically on the submit button, you're going to give it the classes BTN and BTN primary. The reason we use those two classes is primary is meant as the way of signaling this is the main action button. This is the main action that you want to do. In Bootstrap, by default, that is blue. But if you get into the Sass, you can change that color to be any color you want. So if we have a chance to go and play around with the Sass, then we can try to change that color to something else. But the primary exists there as the color you want to use there because it's the primary action. So here I want to give it a good name. We say, hey, what is going to happen when you click that button? So I'm going to say that is login. Okay. Some websites kind of take the habit of always calling that the submit button. I usually find it better from a user's perspective to give it some meaningful text, just to tell them what, like, this is what's going on. Okay, so we've got that. Things to remember with the button, we typically put a type. Okay, type says what kind of button is it. You'll see the IntelliSense pops up. Button, reset, submit. Just remember, button just says this has no meaning by itself. The button doesn't do anything. Reset is going to reset all of your fields back to their initial values, and submit is going to submit a form. So one of the rules in HTML is that every form must have a submit button. Okay, if you have a form, you have to have a submit button somewhere. That is the default. But just like type with inputs, I want to be explicit about that and say, yes, I do want this to be a submit, so that I'm not accidentally making things submit when I don't want to, or buttons when I don't want, button type when I don't want to.
What is the default action for pressing enter and field?
Is to click the submit button.
So do you want to disable that?
That's a good question. Right? So the default behavior, if I hit enter here, is going to go and yes, it's going to click the submit button. Okay? That really depends. So for a lot of forms, that's expected behavior, right? For a lot of cases, especially for a login form, like I absolutely want to be able to just type things in and hit enter. A lot of users expect that, especially in terms of accessibility. People that are maybe not using a mouse really expect that kind of keyboard navigation. Okay? So that's usually not something we want to disable. There are cases where you may want to go back and change that and change the enter key to not automatically submit a form. But those are generally special cases and you generally have to justify. Does that make sense? Generally, that's something that really should require justification because it's such a standard user expectation of how most forms work. Okay? Yeah, most users expect that behavior from browsers. But it's not always helpful. Okay. All right, so we've got the setup there. We've got the individual components. And I think that's really all the stuff that has to be there, just in terms of putting the skeleton. So is everybody good with that so far? Okay. Things to check right now. I can currently type into the field. I can currently type in the field. I can click the button. You'll notice when I click the button that the page refreshes. And if you're really paying close attention to the URL, you may notice when I hit login that the URL changes slightly, namely that you might see it come back in with that question mark, which is what I saw. So test. So you may notice the URL's changing slightly. So that part is something we do want to prevent. Right? We do want to prevent the actual URL changing. We do want to prevent that refresh of the page. Okay? All right. So let's look at what we need to do in terms of implementing the form. Okay. So the main trigger, right, for you logging in is what? It's clicking on the button, right? And it turns out that even pressing enter on one of the fields triggers a click on the button. in current browsers as I've seen. So all I need to do is hook something to the on-click event of the submit button. So we're going to define a function up top. Function on click submit. That's going to take an event. And I'm going to hook that down here. So on click is equal to EVT arrow on click submit. And I'm going to pass in that event because I need it to prevent the default action. I'm going to format that and bring it over. So that's what's going to link this function up, right? We're going to say on click submit. That's what we're going to call here. That's where we're going to put our logic. I do want to say let's prevent the default behavior. That's going to prevent the refresh. That's going to prevent the form from actually being submitted as a network request, because we're going to end up using our own logic, or we're going to end up using Axios instead to send that request rather than the default browser behavior with forms. Everybody good with that? So that's step one. And I'm going to do a quick console log here just so we can check that this is all working. So console log, log in, and I should be able to go into my console here. Beep. And so we're seeing that login. So let me just check with everybody. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say, let's look at what the users typed in, the email and the password. And if they've typed in admin@example.com and password, we're just going to say, hey, this is good credentials. We're going to show that out as a message to the user. And if they enter anything else or leave the fields blank, we're just going to say invalid credentials, right? So this is the kind of the first cut, just saying yay or nay. These are good or these are bad, before we work all the way to the database thing. So things I want to do, remember that I need to capture the data that users entered, right? Right now, I don't know what the users entered, right? It doesn't trigger any sort of state change in my data, right? So I can't come in here. I don't know what the users entered, right? So I need to be capturing that first. So up here, we're going to say use state, and I'm going to add some state variables. And namely, I'm going to add a state variable for every form field. Things to remember about the use state hook. With the use state hook, this is the initial value that's going to show up there. So we're saying initially the state of that variable is blank. I'm going to do on the left, I'm going to, as we say, destructure it, because use state returns, remember, an array with two elements, the first one being the current value. So this would be email, and the second one is a setter for that state. So you just need to kind of remember that pattern when you're working with the use state. Okay, so here we have two different states we immediately need. because we've got an email and we've got a password. So I'm going to go add in both of those states. You may remember that this is kind of where we started the cart, the shopping cart example. We started with things down in the cart item and we kind of bubbled things up. This is a case where these states, this email and password is going to stay in the login form because no one else needs to know about it. This component knows about that data. The app does not want to know about that data. So this is not going to be hoisted up. Okay, and this happens often. It's going to happen a lot with this project, where you have state that's local to the component and not maybe accessible to anywhere above. Okay, so we've got those. Other things I want to make this work is I also need something to be able to show an error message as well as to show a success message. So I may want to add 2 more state variables for both of those things. Right, so one that I can show in red, one that I can show in green. So I'm going to add those down here. So I'm going to add one for error and one for success. So error, set error, success, set success. That way I have a way to capture both of those messages. And so most of your forms, you'll want those. Most of your forms, you'll want a way to show an error message as well as a way to show a success message. So that's a pretty safe bet that most of the forms on the website are going to need that already. Okay, so let's think about now what we want to do. So in terms of hooking up the submit event, I want to say this. So I want to say email if it's admin at example.com and password is password. Then what I want to do is I want to effectively set the success message to valid credentials or otherwise I'm trying to say, well, let's just say set error to invalid credentials. Okay. This is not perfect. There are some issues here. We want to walk through them. But this is commonly kind of the place where people start. They say, hey, okay, this route is successful, this route has failed. Okay, so I'll write a successful message here and I'll write a failure message on the other side. Okay, so we start with that. We'll notice here, if I hit login, things that we still haven't done is it doesn't matter what you type in, it's always going to be using the email and password right now are always going to be just blank. So for instance, if I go to console.log, I'm on caps lock, console.log, and I log the email and password, okay, it's always going to show me blank there because I still haven't accepted the user input. So things to remember anytime you have these state variables that you want to be hooked up to the field, remember that there's some more code you have to write, right? So in order to get these things bound up, remember that you have to set the value and the on-change property of that field, right? So the value says the current value of this is this, and on-change is what you do when the user changes the field. So the typical pattern that we see here is I would say, okay, value is equal to email for that first field, and on change I need to call a function of some sort. And so I might say EVT arrow law. Now, one thing you can do it this kind of one of two ways. You can say, well, for every single field, I might create a separate function, right? So I might have a function on email change, on password change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a big deal here because we're only dealing with 2 fields, but that quickly becomes an issue when you have a lot more fields, right? Let's say I have 10 fields in there that I need to update. I don't necessarily want to have an on-change handler for each of those. So what I'd like to do is write an on-change handler in there that can work with all of them, right? That's a little bit more generic. Okay, so let's write that function, thinking about what we need. So in the function, and I might call this on input change. Okay, what parameters do I need to this function? It definitely needs the event. Okay. So in here, one of the things I need to do is find out what the value, remember I need to find out what the value is that the user set. So maybe const new value that I can get through EVT current target. Current target is the thing that triggered the event. And then value is the current value of that field. So that'll get me the new value, right? And then what I need to do is call the appropriate setter. So if this is the email that changed, I need to call set email. If this is the password that changed, I need to set the password. Does that make sense for everybody? So what I often will do is I say, well, that's kind of a variable, right? The function I need to call is a variable in of itself. So I would make that a parameter. So I'd say, well, let's pass that in here, set value. And so assuming I have the correct setter, I can just call it. Right? So that's how I want to kind of set this up, right? So this doesn't know which field it's updating, but it'll work with any field, right? It just needs to have the setter, right? So I can wire that up down below, right? So this is the kind of the event handler that I'm writing. When I call that down here on input change, so I'll need to pass in that event, but remember that second parameter I also need the setter. So this would be where I'd pass in like set email. So if I follow this kind of pattern, then I don't have to write a bazillion different little handlers. I just need the one, and I can use this just by using it. Cool? Questions? Does that make sense? So this is kind of a common pattern that we may use. All right, next up, I need to do the same thing with the password field and just change these things to be password and set password. Okay. So we need to remember to hook these things up anytime we have inputs. We need to have the value of the field be hooked to a state, and non-change that basically be hooked up to an event that calls the set. Okay. So these are kind of coding conventions that you'll see on almost all the forms that you want to do in this project, right? Cool. Everybody good with that? That kind of makes sense? All right. So let me try this real quick now. If I start typing stuff in, and there we go. So I've got the values that I typed in appearing down here. That checks out. But I don't have yet, what I don't have yet is I don't have the messages that we're generating showing up. So remember in my submit event, in my click event, I'm setting either set success or set error, right? I want those messages to appear. So I need some sort of way, some sort of place on the UI where I can put those things, right? Where do we usually put those messages? Where do we usually see those on the internet? Your error messages, your success
What do
messages.
your messages refer to?
Huh?
What do they refer to?
So, yeah. Yeah. Well, depends on what it is, right? If it's related to a single input, then I usually would put it under that input, versus if it's related to the form as a whole, we typically see it down here. Okay?
So it's correct credentials, that's it.
Yeah, so we got incorrect, invalid versus valid credentials. We want to show both of those things. So I need to, towards the bottom of this, I'm going to go underneath the div for the login button. I'm going to add another div. Okay, and so this div is going to have a class, MB3 again, and I'm going to make this be the error, and I'm going to make the another one, same thing, below there, make that success. Now, typically I want to give the user some color cues about this as well. So I'm going to give the first one the class text danger, and this one text success. So the success message will appear in green, and the error message will appear in red. Okay. So you can see it immediately pops up, right? So we've got invalid credentials because I didn't type in the right thing, right? If I refresh the page, we should see that those things go away. The message goes there. So you kind of see as you're changing code, it's automatically kind of hot swapping things in the browser, but it's actually keeping the state. It's actually running your new code with the state that was in there previously. So I can do test pass again. We see this appear. If I then type in the correct credentials, admin at example.com, and password. Now here I have a little bit of an issue. Notice that it's saying invalid credentials and also saying valid credentials. Everybody see that? Why did that happen?
Because you never
Right. So error's still in there. What were you going to say?
What you're doing is just finding text to NTK official, so it's still, it'll always stay as it is.
Right. Yeah. So I'm never actually unsetting the error or the success. So if I set success, that success never goes away. If I set the error never goes away. So I need to make sure, yes, I'm resetting things. There's two ways to go about this, and it's really kind of developer preference. I go either way depending on what I need. So one way you can go about doing this is we can just say, well, okay, I always need to set both of these things. So maybe here I'll say let's set error to blank and success to that. And over here I'll set error and set success. So if I just set both of the fields, then I'm guaranteeing kind of what state they'll be in after this is done, right? So this is one way you can solve that problem. This is kind of the simple approach in some ways, because it's just like, okay, I just need to set those additional things. I just need to remember to do that. This works. I tend to find that this usually leads most of the times into me forgetting to do certain things. The other thing that happens is notice that this doesn't change until you know what the answer is, right? So until you know what the answer is, nothing on the screen changes, which can be an issue when you're working with the API. So we may want to change it as soon as the user clicks the button, not after we get the response. Does that make sense? So another approach that we can do to kind of work around this is we can just move it up to the top. So I can just say, well, let's call those things initially. So regardless of what happens at the top, I'm going to reset both success and error. If I set both of them initially back to blank, I know that I'm starting at a good state. This does mean that sometimes you're setting things like setting error and then setting error twice, because you're going to set error twice, you're going to set success twice, but usually avoids doing things accidentally where I forgot to update something. So this is usually the pattern that it is. Cool. Everybody good with that? Either of them would work. But that's the general pattern that would follow. So this way, we'll get invalid. If I switch over, it would say valid. If I change this, it'll go back to just invalid. And that way, we've only got one of those two messages appearing. Cool. This is one of those things that is a lot easier to see before you put all the network stuff in place. Once you start putting the network stuff in place, little things like this tend to get lost in the details. So it's a good thing to kind of get straight before you get buried too deep. Okay, everybody good with that? So, other things you may want to pay attention to. Let me just, as a demonstration here, I'm going to add a class. I'm going to add BG white to both of these elements. So one of the things you may or may not see is, and I guess those are not showing up. They did show up for you? Even if without any text in there?
Well, I still have text in there.
Okay. So one of the things to kind of keep in mind here is the way I've got this code right now, and I was figuring that maybe that would show it. These items are always being rendered, even if there's no content in them, which seems to be working fine, and sometimes that's okay. But oftentimes I may want to hide them and only show them if there actually is content for them to show. Does that make sense for everybody? So oftentimes the pattern that I will follow for these is to make a slight change, and I'll say error and, saying that I only want to show this element if there is an error. Same way with success. The main reason this usually comes up is because even though the height of this might be 0, that margin is still applied. So like there's still MB3. And so sometimes it's detectable that there is still an element there because of the way the margins affect things. So that can be an issue, and that may be one of the reasons why you want to go ahead and hide. Similarly with Flexbox, Flexbox is kind of considering all the elements that are there, even if they don't necessarily have any content. So both for Flexbox and margins, oftentimes it's better to just hide something if it's not supposed to be there. Cool. Everybody good with that?
So now we don't have to change the text and second, right? Or do we still?
What do you mean? Change the text inside of it. What's the question?
Well, here, so they hide it visually, so they can render.
Right, we won't render it. We won't render it in the .NET.
And replacing that also with proving it to
Yes.
error and success.
Yes,
So
exactly.
empty string is faulty.
Empty string is faulty.
Okay, so we do have to do it.
Yeah, we still have to erase it. Remember, if we didn't erase it, it still would have the old value in there, right? It still would have the old value in there. So that's not mutually exclusive. We have to do both. Okay, cool. So that's just a good thing to know in terms of dealing with your error handling and having errors you want to show. Is we often use that conditional rendering trick with that and have a success and an error field. One of the things that some people have done, especially when back in the jQuery world, a lot of times people would kind of just have the same elements and change the class. I find it better in more, it tends to make more sense to just keep them as two separate things rather than changing the class. I usually find that way. So that's kind of personal preferences. That's the way I like to do that. Okay. So does that make sense so far? Right? So we've got your basic setup of a login form. The next thing I want to do is, if it is successful, I need to pipe that data up to the application. So the application knows that you just logged in. Okay? So remember when we set up the application, we had an app component, right? And remember I created these onLogin functions, right? So I want to be able to call this from the login form. Does that make sense for everybody? How do I do that? How do I get access to that onLogin?
Send it down.
Send it down, right? Send it down as a property. So we send it down, and then we're going to receive it and use it down below. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to here, where we brought in the login form. I'm going to call onLogin. onLogin. So remember, this on the left is the key. That's the name of the property. And this is the value that I'm passing it. Oftentimes, these are going to be the same name. That's okay. In fact, I usually prefer them to be the same name, if I can. Okay. So we're going to pass that down. And then I'm going to come back over to the login form. And we're going to receive it here. So now I have access to that onLogin function. Okay. It's worth knowing that this login form doesn't know what onLogin is doing. It doesn't know what's going to happen when we call that function. And it doesn't know where that function exists, which is helpful, especially if you need to change your app entirely in a lot of different ways. You may change your layout. You may have move this to a different screen. It doesn't really know that, right? All it knows is there's a function that somehow I got, and I can call that. So that's really, really helpful from a refactoring standpoint to have that be extracted like that. So here, what I'm going to do is, if it's successful, I'm going to call onLogin. Okay. Now, remember onLogin, I said I want to pass this auth object. So I need to construct this locally so we can pass it down. So let's think about what data we have. I can say const auth is a new empty object. I can pass that down, but what data would be useful to put into auth? Would it be useful to know the user's email later on? Maybe. So I might want to take that, throw it in here. Well, I probably don't need to break that onto separate lines like so. But I might say, hey, let's put their email into this auth object and pass it, right? So then later, maybe I want to show their email on the nav. I could do something like that, right? That's kind of a common thing, is you might see some information about your profile up in the navigation bar. So that can be your email, it can be your full name, your user ID, all those kind of things. That way we have it later. We will eventually put the token in. Yes. So I'm going to put the token in there too. I'm not going to turn it into the token, but I will put the token into that object. So that's part of what I want to send back. And so now if we try that, if I try that with the credentials, you can see now it's taking us over to the pet list. Right? And if I want to check the auth stuff is there, one thing I might do is kind of go back into the nav bar, you'll remember that I previously piped in auth, right? So it's available here. I can go put that into the nav bar somewhere, right? So I want to do that. I'm going to go up here. Let's see, maybe I do it first. So I'm going to do it before the UL. So right around here, I'm going to add in a span /span. And here I want to display the auth.email, which should be populated as soon as I log in. So I'm going to put that in there. I want to give this the class, if I remember right, of navbar dash text. There we go. So now, once I get logged in, you can actually see my email address.
I got a really weird error.
Yep.
Cannot read properties of null.
Okay. So you notice it's working for me right now. It's because of the way I did things. If I refresh, I'm going to have the same problem. Okay. So what's happening here is when I refresh, note that I've lost all my state. So what was auth initially? Auth was null. Okay. So what's happening here is to say I can't read properties of null. It says it's trying to read the email property of something that's null. So what's happening is it's trying to read this, but auth is null.
I guess my question is, how come it's not putting me at the login screen?
How come it's what?
It's not putting me at the login screen. I haven't even logged in yet.
That's the whole point, is you haven't logged in yet, which is why the auth is null. Auth is null initially. So I have to consider that. I have to realize that initially auth is going to be null, and I have to code for that. Otherwise, I get things like this. Okay. So I need to somehow check that. Okay. Now, easiest way to do that is to just wrap it in a conditional and say auth and there. So that it only gets rendered if you're logged in. Rather than it getting rendered all the time, that means it only gets rendered once I'm logged in. So remember, auth being null means you're logged out. Auth being non-null means you're logged in.
I answered my own question now. I thought about it more.
So I have to code for both cases. I have to code for the logged in case versus the logged out case. Other things we may commonly do while we're thinking about this is you'll notice that the login button is always here. Login button appears regardless of whether or not you log in. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? The login button should only appear if you're not logged in, right? So because I've got this global state, it actually is pretty easy to handle that because I can just say, okay, well, we'll hide that element, right? We say, if not auth, and wrap that around this list item. Okay, so now I have the login button only appears if auth is null, right? So if I refresh this, we're going to get back to the login button being there, and when I log in, it'll be gone. So this conditional rendering is very powerful, right? It's ways to hide things as well as ways to show things based on what the state of the data is. And so notice that even like the nav bar doesn't know how auth is being set, right? It doesn't know a lot of that logic. It's completely disconnected, right? That's happening over in login. Is calling this on login. that's getting piped over here. Right? So we have these kind of side effects. Other things I might want to do, so let's say you are logged in, right? Okay, I want the login button to disappear. What button do I want to appear? Log out, right? So I kind of want to do the opposite, right? Once you log in, then I need to put the log out button there. Okay, so I can kind of borrow what I have and say, well, let's implement that, but we'll implement that a little bit differently. So when you are authenticated, then I want this to be able to call, I want this text to be log out. Okay. I do want it to send you back to the login screen, but I need it to actually log you out, right? So I need it to not, like, calling on navigate is not sufficient to get me logged out. Does that make sense? So one of the things that I had hooked up previously is, remember that we've got over in the application, we need to call this method. So I need to call on logout and put the logout link from the nav bar. Does that make sense for everybody? So I need to also pipe that down, right? So if I'm going to pipe that down, well, that means I need to add it down here at the property, and you say, hey, this nav bar now needs access to the on logout function. So on logout is equal to on logout. So I'm going to pass that down additionally. I'm going to bring it in here. Kind of like I passed the, the on login button down to the login form. So on logout here, and then I just say when you click on the logout button, we're going to call on logout, but on logout doesn't take any parameters. It doesn't need any data. So if I try the logout button now, log out. There we go. So just like that, I can log in, and I can log out. Pretty simple. Questions so far? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. I'll call it 15 minutes and come back at 2:50. If you're still having troubles getting the log out and the login working, definitely stick around and I'll try to troubleshoot those with you right now. But if you do have that working, go ahead and take a break. Yep. Yeah, so on logout, login is not functional. So basically what's more than likely happening is it's either being passed down. Oh, yeah, you're missing code basis. Because it's an object instead of a function. Okay. Yep. That's fine. So because it's the destructure, the object that's coming in is props, and so I'm keeping lock the on-logging property from that props object. So there's an implicit destructure, nothing of this. So okay. So control X, right again, and it should work this
Telling me the password. Oh, I see this on the date.
Yes.
This is a quick close here, but I think I want to save that. That's fine.
Yep. And so is your logout working now?
I guess that's how I did it. Questions on that? Yep, no questions. See how you go here. So you're buying on a few things. So you really just need to take the left. I will, you have the string going. I'll pull up that section of the code here.
So you can take a look at it.
So that's what I'm talking about. And so if you walk that way. Okay.
I thought I missed this now.
Okay. And then should be all. Okay. So what you're probably missing is go to the login form scroll up. So here, oh, okay, so on login, tabs down, okay. Go up to the app. Yeah, okay, you see how it's laid out? That says it's not removed. So scroll down. You need to pass the on login function down to the login form. On login, and for the app one, you want to pass something. The form is going to be very checked out. Right now, good. And then lock that on. Now, go back and log in. Now, there's a problem here. Go back. So that password from your account. Yeah. Go back and look at your login. Maybe the types on it. This one needs to be typed in. No. So that means that was zero. Okay. Now, it looks like when you're logged in, let's go look up in the it looks like your email's not here. So you got that. Let's go to so you see how on this it's not showing up there for me. This is the one pass. Otherwise, it's like showing up. You get that all sorted out? So what happens if you just log in right now? You have to call us. We're trying to call on log out, but it's not. So we added in here. Oh, yeah. try and log in. Just hit enter by the way. Okay. And now see that says logged in. Good, it's already changed. So you log out. So you kind of see that process, we're starting to kind of wire that up. And a lot of it's working just from the React standpoint, not even the table sometimes. That's
Yeah.
so things started making more sense for React. So kind of seems to be that's a good question. So look how it's logging in, logging out. And so that was in there. So something about that. Something bad. It's not because it's in this way. I guess it's yeah, I'm just trying to see what things I want to talk about. Okay, so that's good. Okay. So go back to the login form. So if you're missing, you will see that. So what we did is we did in here, then we did something like this on login function. So we need to put the off object first. So cross off. Increases. And right now, we'll just put it. So it's a real And then from there, you want to enter and follow that. So add and all that. So you see it's calling. So you go down, you go down, then you see that you know, okay, so you leave one in the so if you're using it here, but you need that on the top. So is this process kind of starting to make sense? We're starting to wire things together. So the login form kind of has its job. The app has its job. The app is kind of that go-between for a few different things, right? So managing your login state is really kind of the job of the application, but where you actually change the state is not in the app per se. It's in the nav, it's in the login form, or the registration form as well. Okay? So things that are still outstanding that we want to do, I do want to break this out as a separate element. We haven't done that yet. I need to hook up things to Axios, and I also, one other thing you might want to do is show some errors if the fields are left, or maybe show something different, especially with the form side. So the thing I'm going to try and tackle next is the API requests. So here's where we start getting into actually sending it to the backend. So what I'm going to do, I need to get to my terminal. View terminal. Get in here. And I need to actually kill the build. Control C, yes. Because we need to install a dependency. So I'm going to do npm install Axios. Let me bring that. Okay, so we're going to install that. And I'm going to go start the server backup. So npm run start. So what Axios is going to help us with is, as I've said before, is kind of making HTTP requests. Historically, you often may have heard, like a long-running term we've used in the industry is the term called AJAX. So AJAX is something that came out, I can't remember, early 2000s, late 90s. I think it was early 2000s. And it stands for asynchronous asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So that's what this AJAX acronym is for. It's evolved quite a bit, right? So before AJAX, we actually didn't have any way of sending data to the server without refreshing it. Because a form out of the box, just you send the data to the server, you make a post request, you make a get request, and then the browser has to send a complete brand new page back. Okay. So what AJAX allowed us to now do is to send requests kind of outside of that. I'm just going to make an HTTP request anytime I want to without refreshing the page, which is awesome, right? I mean, think about anything you can do in Postmail. You can basically do that anytime you want. So the old way of doing this, the original way that we used, the original way that we did this was, I think the class was XML, HTTP, request. It's been so long since I've done it directly here. So this is the class that's built into the browser that we historically used to make these requests. And so one thing you might notice in here, there's this little language, little acronym called XML. Okay. So XML used to actually be the most common way that we sent data back and forth. It's kind of similar to HTML, but we really switched over to using JSON. You've seen that in all the Postman and all the API stuff we've done. We've been passing data back and forth as JSON instead of XML. It turns out that this kind of is a misnomer because this class actually works with any kind of data. So this can actually work with any sort of text you want to send back and forth, XML and JSON. And so this is still something that sometimes people will use this class directly. There's some cases where you may want to do that. Unfortunately, this class is a bit of a pain to work with because it's basically 20 years old. And the API doesn't make a lot of sense. So most people don't use that. There's also a newer API in browsers, so this one's built directly in the browser. There's a newer API called Fetch. So the Fetch API. Both of these two options for sending HTTP requests are built into the browser. Both can work with XML, both can work with JSON. This type of thing. Okay. So the way that Fetch works is actually pretty simple. We want to make a GET request. It just looks like this. So let's say I want to fetch google.com. HTTP You just write that into your browser. It will make a GET request to Google. To whatever URL you give it, return it back. In fact, you can make any kind of request you want that way. So you make GET requests, you make PUT requests, but it's that simple. Now, it's based on top of promises. So you also then have to receive the response. And so we would do something like then, take the response, do something with it. Maybe process the response. If there's a problem with sending a response, then you get an error. And so that's the basic syntax of working with Fetch. Turns out really simple API. If you need to pass it in as post requests, it's basically just you change what parameters you pass in here, and so there's a way to do that. But that's kind of the structure. Okay, so it's worth noting that both of these things are actually built directly in the browser. This one is the older version, so more browsers, older browsers, like if you want to work with IE, then this is the one you need to do. If you're working with modern browsers, basically all the modern browsers have this one, except for IE. Okay. So those are the two things that are built in the browser. What I'm actually going to be doing here is I'm going to be using, we just installed a library called Axios. So the good news is that Axios works a lot like the Fetch API, but it does make a lot of things easier. Is the long story short. Is there is some gotchas with how you deal with both the success and the error cases with the fetch API built as well as the XML API. So the reason that we're using this, A, it's a very popular tool. Everybody's using it. B, it actually is easier to work with either, rather than working with either of those libraries directly. Good news is it's that simple, for at least the simple case of understanding. So we say, hey, we make a request. Where do you want to make the request? If it's successful, we'll go to then. If it fails, we'll go to catch. Are we good with this? So I'm actually working with promises here directly. It's also possible to use this. Remember, promises you can use with the async await syntax. So it's also possible to do that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow this syntax, but it's worth mentioning that you can also do this. The response equal to await Axios, pass in that URL, and then we catch okay. So these syntaxes are kind of equivalent. Okay, you can use the try catch and the wait syntax. It's possible to use those with the fetch API and that. More typically, though, we tend to use the then, the next, partially because just setting up the rigor of using async await is usually kind of more than is necessary for the types of things we do. Cool. But it's worth keeping in mind that it is possible to do that now. But we usually do it on the latter. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go to my onSubmit function, right? And we're going to pull this in. So up at the top, I need to import Axios. So I'm going to import that Axios from Axios. And then I'm going to go down here. Now what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to comment out that whole block. So previously we were hard coding in, we're saying if it's admin and password, then it's good. What I want to do instead is send that email and password to the server and have the server tell me if it's good or bad. Everybody good with that? Okay. So like I was showing up on the board, it's going to start out with a call to Axios. We need to tell it what URL we're going to. So in our case, this is going to be http://localhost 5000. Remember, that's where our server is running locally. If your server was running on, if your backend was running on, say, port 5001, you'd need to put that port there. Okay? So I'm kind of presuming that the backend port is 5000 in there. I also need to include the actual path to the API route. So we're going to do at the end of that API/API/user/login. So I'm putting in that full route to the login route. You'll probably notice that that looks the same as what you did in Postman, because Postman is another HTTP client. So here we're just programmatically kind of sending those requests that we did, the same kind of requests that we did with Postman. And that's part of why Postman is such a good development tool, because you can try these things before you have the code kind of in place. So next thing I need to do is I also need to pass in some parameters. So the second argument, the first parameter here is the URL. The second parameter is a bunch of configuration options. They really depend on what you're trying to do. So remember that the user login, do you remember what method that needs to be? What? Huh? That's a post, which is right. How can we find that from the code? Well, if I look at the backend code, right, I'm going to go back to the user
module. Well, remember when we hooked that up, remember we specified that here. Where's my login route? There it is. So I said post login. Okay. If I don't specify the method, it's going to be coming in as a GET request, and it'll just say, hey, I can't get this. It's not going to work out the way we need to. So method is GET is post. Okay. The other thing we need to do is we need to actually send the data to the server. So namely, we need to send the username and password that user entered. Okay, so we pass that in as data. Okay, and we're going to pass in the email and the password. So that's going to bundle it up into an object, send that to the server. Server can now read that data. Okay, from there, we'll say then. Okay, then we'll receive the response. And we'll want to say, well, what do we want to do with the response? And we'll also want to figure out what to do with the error. So if something goes wrong, we'll go to catch. But if the request is good, we'll go to the then case. Okay. So just for simplicity, I'm going to do a console.error in the catch case and log out the error. And if it's successful, I'm going to do console.log res. Okay. So this is not going to give you user any feedback yet, but we should be able to see on the console kind of what we're getting back. So I'm going to pull this up. All right. So if I leave it all blank, which should be my first test, I leave all the fields blank and I hit login. It's going to say invalid credentials. Did I save things? Because it shouldn't be saying that. Let me refresh. So there it goes. Okay. So logged something out. There we go. So do you see what it said when it came back? It says network error. So I tried to make this request and it says network error. You're going to see this come up a decent amount of times. It's worth knowing what this means. Typically this means your backend's not running. And a good way to kind of check that is you can kind of pull this out a little bit. There is a network tab down here. In the network tab, I'm going to clear this out and try to log in again. In the network tab, you can actually see any of these XHR requests that are going through or AJAX requests. So I can click on a specific request and actually look into it in the network tab. And so I can see, okay, what are the headers, what are the data I'm sending there, and what is the response? If we kind of look here, we can see that actually there is no response coming back. So we've got a request that we're kind of trying to send, but no response that is coming back. Yeah, there's the actual request. It's that one above. So oftentimes I'll jump in here and kind of look at this one. Okay. Is there a place that we can see? You'll also notice in here there's kind of no status code, right? Usually when things come back, we'll have a status code of 500 or 400. So I need to go to my server here, pivot option v2. Yep, as I figured, it's not running. So I need to go in here, npm run start dev. So network error, there is usually indication that things are not online. Oh, this is the wrong project. what I need actually is this one. Which it looks like also is not running. npm run start dev. Okay. Backend's booting up. There we go. Back to the console. Clear it out. There we go. So if the server's running, now you should see a different response. So we got request failed with status code 400. Okay. Which is good. That's actually what we expect, right? Because right now I haven't typed in username and password, right? So you'll kind of remember how we set this up. We have Joy on the back end, remember, validating the data that comes through. And so if Joy says there's a problem, then we're sending back a 400 response. Did they see that? So you kind of remember how we set that up in the back end. And let me jump back over to the network tab. We can see the actual response that's coming back. So we can see here 400 bad request. I can see the data that we sent. We sent an email and a password, but they were both blank. And I can also go to a preview. This preview will show me what came back to us. So we've got an error. You can see original email, yada yada. If I expand this down, you can kind of see the details. And so within the error that's sent back, you can see that its email is not allowed to be empty and password is not allowed. So both of these things are coming back from our Joy scheme. Cool. So you're kind of seeing in the browser, you can get some of the same information that you see in Postman. Okay. So things I want to notice here. Things that can trigger the catch, right? Any network errors that you have, those will trigger catch. So like if the server's down, that'll trigger it to catch. Any 400 errors you get that. Those also trigger the catch, same with 500 errors. So it's not just network errors that trigger catch, it's any 400 or 500 errors will also trigger this catch. Cool. So we'll have to kind of handle and deal with all of those pieces in the catch case. Now, let's say it is successful, okay? Let's say I do type in the correct email and password. See what comes in now. So if I type in the correct thing, see console log, and we can see the response that it sent back. Okay? So the object that we got back has a bunch of things on it. You can see the status of this was 200, so that's okay. But important things you want to look at is the most important thing you want from the response is the data. The data is the actual stuff that we're looking at. So if we look at res.data, we'll see, okay, there's what I sent back. There's my welcome back. There's message welcome back. There's my token. There's my user ID. There's all the data that we sent back from our API, right? And if we want to verify with that, we can look at the API backend, and you can see what I'm doing here, right? So that's what we're ending up getting back. Yeah. Uh-huh. So we use the curly braces in this one. Here, this is so that's kind of what we're seeing, right? So that's the data that we're getting back. So what we can do on here is I can read that data, right? So I can read from the response, right? So if I dig into that, remember what we were doing previously. We were saying, let's set success if it's successful. Let's set error if it fails, okay? So what I can do is I can kind of work through here. I'm going to push things down a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to log, and I'm going to call in the successful case, so set success. And so what I want to display as the success message is res.data. So data, remember, is what the response data was that come back. There's that message in there. So I'm going to set it that way. And then in the case where it failed, what I want to set is the error dot message. Okay. So I'm going to start with that. This is not going to be kind of where I end up. We're going to refactor this a little bit as we kind of figure out how to deal with the different cases. But there's my starting point. So I'm going to say let's set the success message in this case, and let's set the error message in this case. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what we had done previously with the if statement. Going back to the browser, let's try logging in again. Okay. So in this case, you can see, hey, there's my welcome back, right? So if I type in the right credentials, if I leave these things blank, now I'm seeing that request failed with status code 400. Okay. So I've got something, right? I've got something. It's not perfect yet because that error message is not terribly useful, right? So unfortunately, it turns out like the success case is probably the easiest case to figure out. The hard part is figuring out, like, what do I do in the error case? Like, how do I handle those errors? Tends to be quite a bit more complicated, right? Because what I actually want to tell the user is that information that came back from Joy, right? Like, hey, this field was invalid or that field was invalid, right? That's where I'm kind of trying to get to. So everybody good with that? So what can I do? Well, I can, for instance, I could look at the status code, right? I could look at the status code and maybe give the user a different error message depending on that, would be one thing I could do. Or I could dig down into the logs. So what I might want to do is kind of looking at, in this case, I can dig into error. When you get the error back from Axios, it also gives you the full response. So I can say error.response.data.error. Okay, so if I do something like this, this will work its way down all the way to the error that we sent back. Let's take a look at what that does. Now, out of the box, not working. Okay, so the problem is that this error that comes back, and it's kind of talking about here, the error comes back is actually an object, right? And when I try to feed that into the error, it tries to put that into the HTML, and it's like, well, I don't know how to render that object, so it barfs. Okay, so one thing I could try to do is I could try to say, well, let's just call toString on it. Let's just take that error that comes back and let's call toString on it. Boop. Oh, I need to just open this up in an incognito tab again. Okay. So if I try to leave it blank, notice what I get. Object, object. So things to remember in JavaScript, out of the box, most things don't have a toString method, right? That actually does anything useful. So if I just try to toString it, then that's all I'm getting, right? So oftentimes you have to be a little bit more clever, okay? But at least that keeps us from crashing, right? Okay, so other things we can do, we can take advantage of JSON and try to stringify. So let's take a look at here. This is still not going to be what we want, but it might help to kind of see what's going on. So JSON stringify the error. Okay. I'm going to save that and try it again. Okay. So there at least I can see all of the JSON that kind of we're getting back. Right? Yes.
I went into the network tab like we talked
Yeah.
about earlier, and I'm looking at the error object, generating and sending it back to us.
Yep.
But there isn't a response field, and then data and error after that. It starts with error, it goes through into
Yes.
starts with error, then there's an error object inside of it, which has details and the
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Where's this response come from?
So what we're seeing here is kind of down a little bit deeper already. So here we get an error object, right, which includes the message as well as the response. The response is kind of the whole thing that came back. What you're seeing in the network tab over here is just error.response.data. That's what you're seeing. And you're seeing the data. That's why that stuff doesn't. Okay, because this is kind of added by Axios by the front end. So this gets us down to what we're actually responding to. You can remember up here we did response.data. Same idea, response.data. So once we get down to data, we're actually looking at what's there. So I could stringify it. Still not a very useful message to the user because the user doesn't know how to read that. So part of our job as kind of developers is we have to somehow take this structure that Joy is returning and turn it into something that is user friendly. Is everybody good with that? So I have to turn it into something that's user friendly. Okay. If I look at this object, if we dig down far enough, we can see inside of the error, so data.error.details is where the actual information is, where the interesting information is. So the response is an object, the error is an object, details you can see is an array. Do you see that? Details is an array. And details is an array specifically of objects. So if I look at these elements, right? So at the first index, we've got an object, and the part I really want is this message. Here I also want that message. So what I want to try and extract is the messages that are all the way down there. Nested if you notice that. So everybody see that? So what I want to try to get to is response, error.response.data.error.details, 0 message, and 1 message, right? So there's going to be a lot of code to extract this. There's no way around that because it is nested so deep, okay? So we have to think about, like, how are we going to do that, right? Well, I could kind of take the naive approach and just go down to the first one. So error.details.0.message, right? So this is the long way of writing all that out. Okay, and so if I dig down there, we now see email is not allowed to be empty. Okay, I need to add some more error handling because, like, if I try this is going to not work in every case, right? I don't know how many errors there are going to be, and there may be other things like this that may not be there. Remember, every time I'm doing a dot for one is a place where I'm saying, let's dereference the thing before. If error is null, this fails. If response is null, this fails. If data is null, this fails. If error is null, this fails. If the details is null, this fails. If there's not an index 0, there's no problem because I can't get the message of null or undefined. So I have to be pretty careful with my error checking. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'll show you some techniques about how to work that down. But effectively, this is what we're trying to get. Cool? And what I really want it to kind of maybe look like, one way I might want this to look, is I might want to say, okay, let's spit this out as an array of errors, and maybe wrap each of those errors in a div of some sort. Div boop, 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 comma, and that. Now, I do need curly braces here because I need to jump back into the JavaScript world. Don't copy this code yet because we're not there yet, but I'm kind of showing you what I want to do. Okay, so here's the output that I want to try and get to. Is I want to try and get to something that looks like this. I'm going to take each error that we get, each error from the details, one by one, and we want to turn that into a graph. Is everybody good with that? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's my goal, right? My goal is to get from where we are at to generating this. Okay. Now, you'll notice there's an index. Index usually means we need some sort of, right? Index typically means I need some sort of. You'll remember that a week or two ago, I also introduced you to map. Remember doing map? Map is kind of like a loop. Map is really helpful. It's really helpful, especially for something like this, right? So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to map the details, each detail one by one, to this div. Okay? Is everybody with me there? Okay. So I need to bring in Lodash because I haven't brought in Lodash yet. Import underscore from Lodash. And so what I'm going to do, it is already installed. Yeah. So I'm going to comment that out. And so what I want to do instead is I'm going to call set error. And what I'm going to do is underscore dot map. And you can kind of see where the array is. To get to the array, I have to go all the way down here to details. So I'm going to say error.response.data.error.details. That's the first argument to map. That's the actual array. And then I'm going to have a lambda function here, error function, that says take each detail one by one and give me a div. So give me a div, and it's going to be x.message. Right. So that is going to give me the same output as what I had before, but then allow it to kind of loop through the details one by one. So I don't have to hard code in like index 1 and index 0. Is everybody good with that? It's kind of weird. We're maybe a little bit new to map, but that's the kind of idea. Is we loop through one by one the details and we call this function to a new array of divs. Okay. So other things to remember is, remember, as I said, that these different parts can be null. Okay? So I have to guard this some way so that this doesn't crash when those things aren't there. Does that make sense? So like error details might not always be here, depending on what response I get. Good with that? So what I need to do is kind of wrap this per se in an if statement. So I could say if, now this is going to look very messy. I'm going to show you a way to clean it up in a second. So if you don't want to copy along, don't copy along yet. I'm going to show you the long way of writing this, okay? Because this is historically what we've had to do. Error and error dot response and error dot response dot data, and you kind of see I'm just adding a piece one by one, and then the whole thing. So traditionally what I've needed to do is guard it like that. Check each of the pieces down one by one. It's like, well, this could be null, and that 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 could be null. So I have to check each of those things, because if I don't check the one before, well, the error could be null, this could cause an exception. Does everybody kind of make sense there? So this is the long way of writing this. And unfortunately, some of the older languages like Java, you still have to write these things out, unfortunately, because they haven't added the newer syntax. And in fact, this used to be what you had to do in JavaScript up until just a year or two ago. So recently, JavaScript has added a really, really nice little syntax bit, which makes this a lot easier. Okay? And this is what we used to have to write. If you see this in real world code, that's why. Everybody good with that? You can understand why I needed to do this? Okay, so there's a shorthand. Here's what we do. Rather than saying all of that, I can do something like this. Error, question mark dot, response, response, question mark dot. Actually, let me just write it this way. Because what happens, instead of just saying dot, we say question mark dot. Okay. This is a kind of an interesting little syntax. And we haven't really run into it yet. I've debated about covering it sooner, but it's like definitely something we need to look at. Pull up my side thing here. So this is what's known as optional chaining. Okay. You see the question mark. Where else have we used the question mark before? Where else have you seen the question mark? Ternary, right? So a good thing to realize is like, well, maybe when I see this question mark, that oftentimes it means it's some sort of shorthand or shorthand for ternary. So there's a few different ways where this question mark appears now. So ternary, just to kind of bring it back to your attention, is you say you have some sort of Boolean expression. And then you might say, here's the value that you get when it's true. Here's the value you get when it's false. So we've seen ternaries a few times, hopefully by now. Okay, that's kind of how that works. You may have also seen something like this. Does everybody remember seeing that? Kind of like a default? We call it nullish coalescing is the name of this one. So what this, remember, this is a shorthand for a ternary, okay? So this one is equivalent to x question mark x 4 or 5 kind of thing, right? It checks if it's truthy or falsy, not truthy or falsy. This one actually checks for null or undefined. If it's null or undefined, then it gives you 5. Okay? All right. So this optional chaining is kind of the same idea. So what it does is it doesn't call the next thing if the thing before it is null or undefined. So if error is null or undefined, it won't ask for the response. If the response is null or undefined, it won't ask for the data. If that's not there, it won't ask for error and vice versa. So it implicitly gives us an if statement at each of these dots. And so basically what happens if any of those things are null or undefined, then you get null or undefined as a result, which means that this comes out falsy and we don't run that code. Everybody good with that? Now, what I have here is a little bit redundant because I'm writing it twice. You see that? Here I'm writing with optional chaining, here I'm writing without. So what I usually do is I just toss it in a variable. So I would say here, I might say const error details. Save that to a variable, and then I can just reuse it in both of the places where I need it. And that gets rid of the duplication. So this optional chaining is very, very useful, and it turns out it's really not that complicated. So it just doesn't call the next step. So you can use this with properties, or you can use it with method calls. So it's kind of the safe way to do some of these things. Cool. Any questions? Does that make sense? You kind of see why the value is? That's opposed to writing all of this, which is what we would have had to write otherwise. And check all the levels out. Okay. So sometimes, right, if it's coming back from joy, right, it's going to come that way, okay? And so in this case, we're then seeing the errors from joy. Okay. I can even try some things like put in a 4-little password, and you can see that the error from joy changes and it says must be at least 8 characters long. So it's checking those different things. Or I can put email in here, test, and also say, hey, this must be a valid email. So you can see the different error messages that are coming back. Everybody good with this so far? Does that make sense? What we're doing here. Huh? So it takes a little bit of manipulation to get from the joy error to what we want it to show on screen. Now, let's watch and see what happens if I type in credentials, but I type in incorrect credentials. So test at example.com. Okay. No error showing up because we're not handling that case. Okay. So let me put something in real quick just so we can see one thing. So in this case, otherwise, if there's no error details, I'm going to say set error and just send it to error.message. Okay. So if I type in invalid credentials, the error comes back different because it's not coming from joy. Everybody see that? So depending on what the source of the error is, you may get different kinds or different formats to this error object. So here we're saying request failed with status code 400. Okay. Let's look at the back end.
So on the back end, if I type in the incorrect credentials, what happens? Well, it goes down here.
Okay. So in the case of Joy, the error was a whole object with details and all those kind of things. But in this case, the error is just a single string. Does everybody see that? So I also have to be kind of conditional. Say, well, is the error a object? Is it a string? And I need to treat it differently based on how the response comes back. Everybody kind of seeing that? So things I might do, I might say, okay, let's go back to our front end code. And I might say, well, let's see if there is, if this is a string, if that part is a string, then we can show it directly. Otherwise, we're going to do the details approach, right? So maybe I pull just that part off, right? This is the error that came back in the response, so I might call that res error, right? Because kind of the way we had set it up on the back end is we say, if there is an error, we're going to send back an error property. It's just going to change what's there. So what I might start with is let's pull that off. We'll say res error. Say if there's a res error, if that is there, we'll do one thing. Otherwise, we're going to do something else. So I'm going to comment this out a second. Okay. So if that's there, then I need to handle it and I need to look as their details. Otherwise, I'm going to need to go back and fall back to like just showing the message. So my fallback is still that. Okay. So what I want to say is let's look at the error. Let's figure out what type it is. Right? And so one of the things that you may or may not remember from kind of working with JavaScript is remember you can get the type of an object or type of variable. Okay. So I can go in here, I can say if the type of res error, if the type of the error that we received, if it is a string, well then we're done. We just need to show that error directly. So I might say, hey, if it's coming back as a string, let's just say set error res error. And otherwise, I need to see, does it have the details? So maybe else if, notice how we kind of had this down here, right? So I've brought this down a little bit. Details. In that case, then I can kind of do what I had done previously. Basically, what I'm doing is breaking it off a little bit early. So I'm saying here is the place that the error would come back with. If it's there, then we're going to process it based on what kind of thing it is. And maybe in the else case, I might say unknown. Because I don't know what's going on here. So saying it could be a string, it could be an object with details, it could be maybe something else. Okay. This looks like a lot of it. Maybe.
As I said, the error handling is kind of the hard part when we're sending requests.
Why did you comment outcomes error details?
Because I wanted to move some things around. So you see set error, when I grab error details, error response, data, error details, I wanted to grab it up at a one level up. You see, remove the dot details. So here I'm just doing it, not the last part. So I wanted to call that something else. And I want to say, well, I only want to ask for details if the first thing is there. Okay, so let's play around with that. If I hit send now, hit login. So there's their invalid credentials method, which is function which I want. So if I type in data that passes joy, it comes back this way. If I pass in data that doesn't get past joy, then it looks a little bit different. Tracking with me? Okay. So we've got a few different cases, right? So we've got, the server and the backend just sends back a string. We've got an error that comes back from joy, or we've got other kinds of errors. And so when we're dealing with other kinds of errors here, that's more than likely going to be things like, hey, there's a network error, right? So let's watch. Let me just show you what happens now if I shut the backend down. Okay. So back to here. It's going to spin a minute, and it should eventually pop up with network error. So that's what's happening. That message we're getting from this case down here. Okay. Does that make sense? So, what about this case? What do we know about this case? Well, it's neither a string nor has the details properly. It could be an object, right? I don't know whether or not it's an object. It could be an array. It could be an object. It could be other things, right? So I don't think right now there's a way that this API endpoint generates this case, right? So oftentimes in that, I want to kind of figure out, well, what do I want it to do? Like, this actually can't happen. Right now, this currently can't happen. But that's just based on the assumption of how our backend is built, right? If our backend changed, that case could occur, okay? So I do need to do something about it, but the question is, what do I do about it when it's a case that I can't really anticipate?
Send the message to, we couldn't get this thing there, please address this one first.
Maybe. That's not very user-friendly. If the user sees that, it doesn't seem very professional. It also means that there's no there's no debugging information. Like, if I have that and I send that to the developers, like, I don't even know how that happened, because it couldn't happen in the first place, right? So whatever I put there has to give the developer some more information about what happened. Okay? What I would do is something like this. We know there's an error in the response. I would like to know what that is.
So do we want to pass it to the user, or is this something that we want to be available to develop?
That's a good question.
We just said we wanted to be information for the developer, but you also said that's not helpful to the user.
So that's the gotcha, right? If I spit it out this way, then that's the data I as the developer want, right? is then I can see what was the actual thing that occurred. Like, what was the data that the server actually sent back? It might not be all that user-friendly, right? So I've got kind of a gotcha, right? There's a double-bladed sword here of like, do I want it to be user-friendly or do I want to be able to fix the problem, right? And so if I'm going to be able to fix the problem, this is what I want. But it's not going to mean much to the user.
Can we keep the message with this console log instead? And then just
We could. Are your developers going to look at the console log? And your users, I mean, are going to use the look at the console log. Yeah. So logging it to console is equivalent to not showing it at all, because your users aren't going to give you that information. So we have some options. You could say console log it, but console log, we're not going to see it. We could say and show a different message to the user. We could say maybe we send it back to the server, which actually I have done in some cases, where you say, okay, I'm going to make another HTTP request here to send that error message back to the server so that it's in our database and so I can later look at the error. Does that make sense? So oftentimes that actually happens, where we may actually make another request back to the server and send it here. Problem with that is, just like this first one can fail and did, that second one can fail and probably will. So where I land, I would just do this. Because what's going to happen is if that case occurs, the users are going to see it. They're going to go, look, what's up here? They're probably going to contact your support and give you a nice screenshot of what's going on. That's usually where I land. It's like, well, maybe it's not the most user-friendly thing to do, but what I know, what I can anticipate, is that users usually give you a screenshot when something goes wrong. So if I can get the data to fix the problem onto the screenshot, that helps. Does that make sense? The part of the trick is figuring out how are you going to get it back, right? And so if you're going to get it back through console log, then you have to somehow tell your users to go look in the console log and get it from there. Or you have to pull it out for them. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
So I'm just going to take that approach. That's the easy approach. Plus then if we end up with something that we need to fix, we don't have to go back in and change it much. I was just like, oh, okay. Something happened, we anticipated. We didn't anticipate more. All right, so that's covered, right? So does that structure kind of make sense? The different errors that we need to handle. This is one of those give and take where, you know, obviously this has some connection to our backend. If we changed our backend, then that could change how this code works. So you do have to kind of work in tandem a little bit with your backend developers. This is not just a strictly front-end problem. It's both a backend and a front-end problem. And things you do on the backend can make this easier. Things you do on the front end can make it harder, vice versa. But you have to kind of be aware of these things. Okay, but does that make sense, right? So we either get a successful response here, or we get an error response here, and then we have to deal with all of that. Now, success is easy, because if we get success, we're only getting that 200 success when the server sent back and said the credentials are right? So from there, I just need to say, okay, well, let's pick out the pieces of data that we want. So for instance, if we look at what we had previously, remember we were constructing this opt object and then calling on login. So I still want to do that up there. I still want to do that when we get a successful response. Okay. So the question is, what do we want to build? All right, so I'm going to bring this up. Set success. Okay. I still have the email because the user typed in the email. But oftentimes I may want to put some more information in there, right? And so if we look at the response that the user sent back, okay, that the database, the backend sent back, we can see that it's sending back three things: the message, the user ID, and the token, right? So I can take those pieces and add it to the auth object, right? I can take some of the things that are sent back and put them back in there. So, for instance, if I want to read that token, is one of the reasons why we sent it back, is I could say, here's the user ID. So user ID is res.data.user ID. So that'll stuff that into the auth object too. And we've got the token is res.data.token. Okay, so if we do that, now the rest of our code, once we've logged in, has access to user's email, has access to their user ID, also has access to their token, which means we can also then send it back to the server. Does this much make sense so far? Kind of breaking those things out? So that's part of what we want to do. Now, you'll also remember that our token, right, is kind of has bundled up information inside of it, right? Like it has information about what role the user is and what their email address and their full name is. So if I could just peek inside of that token, I could find some additional information, right? So what can I do? Can I look into that token? Well, we can. Huh? We need to import something. Yes. So what I want to do, I'm going to go to my terminal, back to my terminal. Oh, I need to kill that one. So I do need to kill the server. I'm going to stop the server so I can install another package. So here, I want to actually install npm install JSON web token. You remember that we used the JSON web token on the back end to generate and validate these tokens, right? So we can also use it on the front end. And this is kind of one of those beauties of working with Node and React is we've got JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the back end. It means you can actually use some of these open source packages on both sides because it's the same language. So I can install JSON web token and use it on the front end, not just the back end. Okay, so I'm going to install it. You'll remember that there's two methods that we used. I believe we used sign to generate a JWT sign to generate a token, and we also used verify to check that it was valid. I don't want to use sign because I'm not making a token. I already have a token. And I actually can't use verify either because I don't know the secret, right? The front end can't know the secret because otherwise that would be public information because all the data on the front end is public. So everybody hear me there? Yeah. Huh? So what are we going to do? So it turns out that that package has a third method, which is actually really useful for this purpose, okay, called decode. So decode kind of does the same thing as verify. It reads the payload, but it doesn't check that it's valid. So I can use decode to say, let's pull it out and trust the server that it gave me a valid token, which is a reasonable assumption, right? So that's what we use. So we use decode instead. So I'm going to restart the, or maybe I won't restart the server yet. I need to bring in JWT. So I'm going to go up here, import JWT from JSON web token. Okay. And so I brought in JWT. And I'm going to go back down here where we have the token. I'm going to say const auth payload is equal to JWT dot decode. In decode, all I've got to do is pass in the token.
So, beep, beep, beep. And then what I want to do is I want to stuff the whole payload in here into the auth object. So if I do a quick console log on auth, get your attention for a minute. Oh, I do need to restart the server. Burp, 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 burp. Yep. npm run start. When I log in this time, we hit F12, so I can see the console. And I'm going to try and log in. And of course it's network error because I haven't restarted the server. npm start run dev. API needs to be up and running. Okay. Okay. There we go. So we get past. We can see here what I'm putting all into the auth. So I've got user's email, I've got their user ID, I've got their token, I've even got the whole payload. So if I want to see all of the data that's in there, I've got it. Cool. So if I wanted to say, show the user's full name onto the nav bar, I could do that pretty easily. I would just need to do auth.payload.fullname. Cool. All right. So that makes sense in terms of decoding the payload. Pretty easy. That way I've got all that data. If there's other data we needed to pass, then we just need to pass that additionally back in the response on the back end. Cool. All right. Checking that everybody's out. What's going on here? Login form, nothing was trying to sell. So going to the form and spelling that we need to get to reference. So so everything is in the government context. So everybody's so then we do this here.
kind of see, okay, so we've got this Axios thing in, we're sending data to the server, we're receiving a response, we're doing things with it. Overall, yes, there's a lot we had to do with kind of dealing with errors, but actually dealing with Axios is pretty simple, right? Based on the stuff we've done with Postman, it's kind of the same idea. So very good with that? Okay. So what do I want to, what's next on my list? So we kind of looked at that. Oh, before we leave here, one thing to keep in mind and one thing you see here. Notice I've hard-coded in localhost 5000. That's an issue, right? Because it isn't always going to be localhost 5000. Why is it not going to be always localhost 5000?
In the config file, didn't we say that if it's taken already, we choose something else?
If it's what?
In the config file, didn't we say if it's taken already, then choose something else?
I think that actually if we start up the backend server, if 5000 is taken, it just crashes, it just stops and doesn't start up. But yeah, it could be running on a different port is one possibility. Is it going to be running like that when we deploy it to the internet? Right? So when we deploy it to the internet, it's going to be more like pet adoption API or whatever, .herokuapp.com. Right? So it's going to be something different when we go to deploy it. Right? So I need to have that be configurable. Okay. I did say that JSON Web Token we can safely use on the front end here. Some packages are safe to use on both front end and back end. Some packages are not safe to use in front end and back end. Config, unfortunately, is not one that we can use here. Okay, so we don't have access to config on the front end. We have access to config on the back end. We have to do something different here. Okay, so other things to keep in mind. All data in the front end is not private. Everything here is public. Okay. Any user that's like looking at the code of your program can get access to any data that's in the front. So unlike things on the back end where we can kind of keep our secrets private, there's no way to do that on the front end. Okay, which means that we don't have secrets on the front. What we can do is if you're looking at, let me pull this up here. So there's some documentation for the Create React app thing we're using to start our projects. It turns out if you're looking through the documentation, they actually have a page about environment variables. Okay. Let me link this to everybody because it's a good thing to kind of read through when you have a chance because there's a lot more details here than I'm going to go over. But the long story short is that it will actually, when it does the build, when it builds your React components, it will actually look at some of the environment variables and kind of include them in the build bundle. So, namely, as long as those environment variables start with React _ app _, those environment variables will get made part of the build. So I can include an environment variable and use it in my code as long as it starts with that. Okay? It turns out, and if you read through this, you'll find that basically .env is already pulled in. So with Create React App, it already is pulled in .env, and it will read their .env files. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to set some .env files. Okay, so what do you want to do is I'm going to go to the React project. Make sure you're on the React project, not on the backend project. I'm going to go down to the bottom here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call this new file .env.local. Okay. Local says these environment variables are specifically for local testing, which is where I'd want to put something like localhost. So inside of .env.local, what I'm going to put is React underscore app underscore API underscore URL. Be very careful that you follow that name exactly, okay? That it needs to be that value. Okay, and then on the right, we're going to put in localhost, HTTP localhost 5000. Okay, so remember it needs to start with that first part, React app, in order for React to pick it up and recognize it and make it available to our code. Now, another thing you might notice here. Do you notice that env local is a different color over in your files? Do you know why that is? Get ignored. So right now this is being ignored, okay, which that kind of came with our node ignore file. Because typically for the back end, we do want to ignore those env files. It's a little bit different on the React front end here. So with the Create React app, we actually would prefer to have these things checked in. And so namely, like, this isn't a really big secret. It kind of like needs to be that way for testing. So we do actually want to check that file in. If we leave things as is, they won't be. So I'm actually going to go into the get ignore, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit. So one thing to know just about the syntax of the get ignore is every line represents a set of like file names or folders that you're telling it, I don't want to check these in. That's the entire purpose of the get ignore. Say, don't check these things in. So this is saying, like, don't check in the logs directory or a file named logs. Okay. So what I want to look for is I'm going to do a Control F on my keyboard. And I'm going to look for .env. Okay. This is actually going to appear in two different places in your ignore file. So the first place you're going to find is this pair of 3 lines here. You see it says .env environment variable file. .env and .env test. So it's ignoring any file named .env or any file named .env test. Cool. Here we want to say we want to check those in. You might notice that there's some comments here. What do the comments start with? Start with a pound sign, right? So I can ignore, I can just comment out that, right? So now I'm saying, okay, if it is named .env or named env test, I want to bring those in. So I want to comment out those 2 lines. I also want to look down further towards the bottom of the file. You'll find another set of conditions: env local, env development local, test local, production local. We do actually want to include those, so I'm going to ignore I'm going to comment out all of those too. So there should be a total of 6 lines that you comment down, 2 in the middle, 4 of them at the end.
Is there a way to right-click .env local file and check it?
There may be, but I actually want to do this, and this is what I would ask you to do on your own projects on the issue tracker project. You just take those rules out. Okay? That makes sense? Because I do want to check this out. Also, in addition to env local, so env local is the one that we're using for local testing. You might notice that here there's kind of mentioned an env production. So I do want that as well. So I'm going to add another file here, .env.production. And that one is going to be basically, that's where I want to put the URL for what the server would be. So I've got this on my other screen. I'm going to copy it over to avoid typing it and making some mistakes. That's where I wanted to say, so when it's in production, it will be something like HTTPS, pendant option, PR Smith, RPF.com. You can use like your own. So I put PR Smith in there. Just put your own name in there if you want to run this. So typically you're going to have both of those. You're going to have a local config, a local env file, and a production file. The local one you're going to use for local testing, the production you're going to use when you actually deploy. And that way you don't have to come back and change it every time you run the Okay. Any questions? So that kind of makes sense in terms of setting environment variables? Okay. So the next question is going to be, once we've got those variables set, is how do you read them over in the JavaScript side? Okay. How do we read them over in the JavaScript side? So over here, I'm going to go back to the login form. Okay. So you see we had previously hard-coded that as localhost 5000. Okay. I want to make that dynamic. Okay. So I need a template string here. So I'm going to switch these over to utilities. And I'm going to use the $, sort of $sign and curly braces, because I want to put in a placeholder. Right? So the value that we have basically put in the environment variable is the first part of this URL. Okay. So the way we read it here is process.env. The name of the variable. So process.env. React app. Actually, let me copy it from the environment variable here file just so I make sure I get it right. There. So it's going to be process.env. React app API URL. So rather than hard coding it in, we're pulling it from the environment. And so that means anytime we make these requests, we're going to have two different places in the code where we're going to want to make requests to the server. We want to make sure that that part comes from an environment variable instead of being hard coded. How does it know which one to look at? So that's a good question. So when I just run npm run start or npm start, it's starting it up, and it's actually starting it in development mode. Okay, and it's also starting it local. Okay. When we go to push it out to Heroku, remember that we got into the config and we changed some of the environment variables there. So namely what we're going to change is node end. Node end, we're going to set that to production. And because we set the environment node end to production, it's going to pick up this when it does the build. The second one. That makes sense? So it's because of the node end environment variable is how it picks it up. Cool. Okay. So that way we don't have that problem. Okay. We're running on to the end of today. So I think I need to kind of stop it here because we don't have time to do the next thing. Because the next thing would be to bring in Toastify and kind of look at that, how we can bring in some toasts. So I'm going to kind of stop here. You kind of start overnight to kind of play around with this. Maybe you can start thinking about how this fits in with your project. But tomorrow I want to do some more with this to kind of work further through it. Is this fitting good? Kind of helping where to go with the project? Explain a few things.
Is that great React app documentation? Is that .dev for the URL? Is that what
Let me pull it back up. Yeah, create React app. .dev. Yeah. So if you want to read more about how these environment variables work, you can check that. And there's a good amount of information for it. That's all we need this new setup. Is just set up one environment variable. I don't think we need any additional ones. But that's a thing that comes up a lot, is needing to set up environment variables. Okay, I'm going to commit what we have. Okay.